will hear.
History is not simply a subject for a few lonely professors locked up in their libraries. It's a communal, shared, citizenly activity in which I would hope that everyone can be involved, from little kids to their grandparents, and from avid book readers to those who turn on their televisions from their sofas. Not to be able to think historically makes poorer citizens of all of us. And that's because history is not simply about the past. As a conversation between the present and the past, it is just as much about us. Now, I don't mean by that we can learn lessons directly from history, but it does teach us about ourselves. It challenges our cultural certainties, and it opens our eyes to different perspectives. Of course, there has been progress, but we still have slaves, even though we don't call them that, and there is no best-selling book in the West that has ever had more readers than Virgil's Aeneid.
I'm sorry for being involved in a paradox situation because, and I just can't solve it with the great resource of the Latin Plauto, who in his Aularia, who inspired the Avaro of Molière, introduced his first character as follows. So that you don't wonder who I am, I'll tell you briefly. I am the familiar lar of this where you've been, where I've been, etc. Well, and the comedian can follow up with his with the plot presentation. You all know who Mary Bird is, and practically you all ignore who I am. So in order to solve that doubt, I'll tell you briefly.
O sea, algo así como...
Something similar to Plauto's lar that I've just mentioned. Yesterday, Mary Bird was invested Doctor Honoris Causa of University Carlos III in Madrid. It's the highest distinction in the academic world. And the chancellor of the university gave me the big honor of pronouncing the Laudatio, and as I had become his godfather, now they've told me to introduce herself to you in this memorable time. The second paradox is that she has decided to speak about the historic oppression over women. But her presentation is... she's going to be introduced by someone with a male aspect. With this male voice will be silent by the wise voice of a woman. We can think that everyone that has come to this auditorium, that is some kind of a Roman Odeon, know the great spread activity of Mary Bird. This headquarters is related to the entity that issues the most renowned videos about the Roman world, and we have to be thankful for that. Many of the people here would have read her lovely works from the book written with his colleague John Henderson, Introduction to the Classics. It's a compulsory reading for my students. to the recent Roman history called Senatus Populus Cua Romanus. Thanks to her reading, we can access a new look about the classic world in general and the Roman in particular. Maybe her research activity, the one that supports that excellent spreading activity, is not well known, but Mary Beard has been researching for many years in an academic world that is substantially masculine, especially in classic studies. From her first steps in research and investigation, she was known as a great specialist in late Republic. Cicerone became one of his goals to decode the intellectual procedures in the building of a Roman discourse after the ideographic models and Hellenic models. At the same time, she paid attention to the religious phenomenon, the Ciceronian introspection, the sexual condition of Vestal virgins, or the introduction of alien goddess Cybele in the Roman pantheon are the starting point to review how we tackle Roman polytheism. It's an effort that led to a great book in collaboration with John North and Simon Price, both volumes, The Sole Religion of Rome, thanks to which many readers have been able to understand the structural modifications of the long Roman religion history from its very beginning, as the beginning of a Romule, up to the arrival of ubiquitous gods, where gods are not a topic anymore, as had happened during the Polish-Hegemony period. That transformation takes us to another paradox that I want to highlight, the one that takes us to the Patible, because that takes to the Patible to someone that declared himself as the Jews' king, and this person became the only god in the Roman Empire. August wouldn't have believed that. Speaking about Jews and other people integrated in the empire, this condition of Roman has different perception levels. The first level is the legal one, but equally relevant is the affection one. Tacit said that very accurately. A Greek agricole, the Roman general, initiated everyone in the liberal arts, so who rejected the Roman language felt passion because of its eloquence. They started to like our way of dressing, and step by step they moved to walk to the baths and to all the banquets. They, very naive, they called civilization what was a factor of their slavery. Agricole 21:2. It's about identity. Building new identities after the unstructuring caused for the conquer all over the world. How to be Briton or Iberian or German or Roman at the same time. Identities, mobility, promotion, oppression, these are well explained topics by Mary Beard, who had been defeated, left their loyals that were forced to look for their food in God. Weapons and triumphs celebrated have been another of the problems that have been studied by her, but sexuality, laughing, and the classic world in the present are other topics too. Once again, we'll have to repeat that Professor Beard observes the present with analytic tools that start from the classic world, and observe the classic world with the epistemological tools of the present. And the Parthenon is very beautiful, but it was just possible in a society with slaves. Patriarchy is something intangible, but effective, that coming from the past still persists in the present as if it was natural, consubstantial, to these human social organizations, a society where women is some kind of jar, as the subrogated maternity defenders state, without voice, silent. In the year 9 AD, Nero Claudio Duccio died at 29 years old. An unknown author, some people think that was a video, wrote a poem of 474 verse known as Consolatio ad Libiam. There, from verse 41, we can read, are your costumes worth it? And after having been so nice to such a spouse, why have you've been able to be the humbles of your merits? Was it really worth it to have a big soul against to that time costumes and not having any kind of vicious and not having been bad to anyone? More or less, that would be the translation, okay? And nobody has had any fear, and you haven't had any influence, and you have limited them all to your house less than you should. With rhetoric questions, we have built what we can expect from a real matron. I haven't been able to find better words to introduce the silence and the power of female voice. And really thankful to giving the floor to someone that should always have been able to speak. The transition has ended up. So, Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, first, let's see if the power... it does. Right. Buenas tardes. We're now in English, but you have translation. I want to start this evening near the very beginning of the tradition of Western literature. And I want to start with the first recorded example of a man telling a woman to shut up, that her voice is not to be heard in public. I'm thinking of one particular moment which is immortalized at the start of Homer's Odyssey, one of the founding epics of the Western literary tradition, almost 3,000 years old. Now, we now tend to think of the Odyssey as the story of the Greek hero Odysseus and the adventures he had returning home after the Trojan War, while for decades his wife Penelope loyally waited for him, fending off the suitors pressing to marry her. And here she is, sitting down on a 5th century Greek pot, sitting by her loom. But the Odyssey is just as much a story of Telemachus, the son of Odysseus and Penelope, and the man who's facing her in this picture. The Odyssey is the story of his growing up, how over the course of the long poem he matures from boy to man. It's a process that starts in the first book of the Odyssey with a telling incident. One day in the family palace, Penelope comes down from her private quarters into the great hall to find a bard performing to throngs of her suitors. He's singing about the awful difficulties the Greek heroes are having in returning home from Troy. Penelope is not amused. And in front of everyone, she asks the bard to choose another, happier song. at which point Telemachus intervenes. "Mother," he says, "go back up into your quarters and take up your own work, the loom and the distaff. Speech will be the business of men, all men, and of me most of all, for mine is the power in this household." And off she goes back upstairs. Now, there is, I think, something faintly ridiculous about this little boy, because that's what he is, shutting up the clever, middle-aged Penelope. But it's a nice demonstration that right back where our written evidence for Western culture starts, women's voices are not being heard in the public sphere. More than that, as Homer has it, an integral part of growing up as a man is learning to take control of the public utterance and learning to silence the female of the species in the process. The actual words that Telemachus uses are significant too. When he says speech is men's business, the word he uses is muthos, which is not in the sense that it's come down to us as myth. In Homeric Greek, muthos signals authoritative public speech, and it's definitely not the kind of chatting and prattling and gossip that anybody, particularly women, can do. Right? So what the man is claiming is authoritative speech. Now, what I want to do this evening is to reflect on the relationship between that classic Homeric moment of silencing a woman and some of the ways in which women's voices are not publicly heard in our own contemporary culture and in our own politics at every level, whether that's in the workplace or in Parliament. I'm talking about a certain social deafness to women's voices, which is summed up in this cartoon. What you see here is a meeting of men chaired by a man, and there's one lady there. And the chairman of the, obviously, committee is saying, "That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it." All right? Now, in case you're wondering, Miss Triggs sounds as silly in English as it does in any language, and in a way that's part of the joke. She has made the good suggestion, and the reaction, and I think many women know this, many women have been at that boardroom table. The man says, "Right, okay, man, you'd like to suggest that? Very good idea." Now, I want to look at that kind of the way we don't hear women, like poor old Miss Triggs, and I want to look at how that might relate to the abuse that takes place against women who do speak out or who are active in public life, I think in any country in the world. I want to look at the abuse they get subjected to even now, whether it's online, in the media, or face-to-face. Now, as Jaime suggested, I'm the first to acknowledge that it's a bit paradoxical for me to be talking publicly in front of an audience about the obstacles that confront women in finding a public voice and a public ear. I'm sorry, that's a paradox built into this paper, but I am aware of it. But let me say now, this is not intended to be a simple 50 minutes of complaint. My aim is to take a long view on the culturally awkward relationship between the voice of women and the public sphere of speech-making, debate, and comment. And I'm hoping that by taking a long view, that will help us get beyond the simple diagnosis that you quite often hear, that this is all to do with misogyny. We often fall back on blaming misogyny. Now, to be sure, I do think misogyny is one way of describing what's going on. But if we want to understand and do something about, which is just as important, the fact that women still pay a very high price if they want their voices to be heard, I think we have to recognise that it's more complicated than simple misogyny, and that there's a very long history to it indeed. Now, you will not be surprised to learn that Telemachus' outburst against his mother was just the first in a very long line of largely successful attempts throughout Greek and Roman antiquity to exclude women from public speech. In the early 4th century BC, the Greek playwright Aristophanes devoted a whole comedy to the hilarious fantasy that women might take over running the state. Now, this was not a work of proto-feminism. It is, in fact, quite the reverse. Part of the joke in Aristophanes' play was that women just couldn't speak properly in public, or rather, they couldn't adapt their private speech, which in this case is almost completely fixated on sex. They couldn't adapt speaking on sex to the lofty idiom of male politics. And it's the same in the Roman world. Ovid's poem, The Metamorphoses, that extraordinary mythological epic about people changing shape, becoming animals and birds and trees. And one of the most influential works, actually, of Roman literature ever, second only to Virgil. Ovid's Metamorphoses repeatedly returns to the idea that women get silenced in the process of being transformed. Here you see a 17th century version of the poor heroine Io, who has been turned into a cow. Io is the cow here, by Jupiter. So she cannot talk, she can only moo. All right? So moo means something in Spanish. Clear? Yeah, moo, right? Have to be very careful with animal noises in other languages. Moo. We'll come back to Io in a minute. In the realm of history, rather than myth, one Roman writer of the 1st century AD managed to find just 3 examples of, and I'm quoting, women whose natural condition did not manage to keep them silent in the forum. Right? His descriptions are very revealing. He writes of them all as freaks. Women speaking in the forum, that's freakish. One, he says, who really had a man's nature under the appearance of a woman, he called the androgyne, the man-woman. Another was impudent enough to plead legal cases in person so that, and I'm quoting again, the men listening to her became tired out with her barking or yapping, her animal noises. And you can see how, a bit like Io, she's sort of deprived of human speech. There are just 2 main exceptions in the classical world to this idea of not allowing women to speak in public. First, women are allowed to speak out as victims and as martyrs, usually to preface their own death. Early Christian women were represented loudly upholding their faith as they went to the lions. And in a famous story from the early history of Rome, the virtuous Lucretia raped by a brutal prince of the ruling house, was given a speaking part solely to denounce the rapist and announce her own suicide. Or that's what Roman writers claimed. And here you have Lucretia being raped at the top and denouncing the rapist at the bottom in a 16th century version of the story. The second exception to women's silence is perhaps a bit more familiar. Occasionally, women could legitimately get up and speak to defend their homes, to defend their children, to defend their husbands, or to defend the interests of other women. So, in the third of the three examples of female oratory discussed by that Roman, the woman, called Hortensia, gets away with speaking in the forum because she's acting explicitly as a spokesperson for the women of Rome and for the women only who have been subject to a special tax to fund a dubious war effort. Women, in other words, may, in extreme circumstances, publicly defend their own interests. They may not speak for men, and they may not speak for the community as a whole. And there's another medieval version, this time of Hortensia, looking rather fetching over there on the right, speaking in the forum to defend the women's interests against the tax. But there's more to this ancient silence of women than meets the eye. This muteness is not simply a reflection of the general disempowerment of women throughout the classical world. I'm sure you all know they have no voting rights, they have very limited legal and economic independence, and so on. Now, in part, the silence of women is to do with that, but I think we're dealing with a much more active exclusion of women from public speech than that. And importantly, it's one with a much greater impact than we usually acknowledge on our own traditions, conventions, and assumptions about the voice of women. What I mean here is that public speaking and oratory was not merely something that women didn't do. It was an exclusive practice and a skill that actually defined masculinity as a gender. As we saw with Telemachus, to become a man, and I mean an elite man here, to become a man was to claim the right to speak. Public speech was and probably the defining attribute of being a man. In fact, one of the standard slogans in Rome, 1,000 years after Homer constructed the figure of Telemachus, one of the standard slogans in Rome actually defined the elite male citizen as, in Latin, vir bonus dicendi peritus, which means a good man skilled in speaking. A woman speaking in public was in most circumstances, by definition, not a proper woman. Or to put it another way, authority was rested solely in the male voice. One ancient scientific treatise actually explicitly said that a low-pitched voice indicated manly courage, a high-pitched voice indicated female cowardice, right? And one 2nd century lecturer, guru, a Greek called Dio Chrysostom, which significantly, I think, means golden mouth, had this to say. Imagine, he asked, imagine an entire community was struck by the following strange affliction. All the men suddenly got female voices. And no male, whether child or adult, could say anything in a manly way. Would not that seem terrible and harder to bear than any plague? I'm sure they would send off to a sanctuary to consult the gods and try to propitiate the divine power with many gifts. You can't have that. And he wasn't joking. I don't think he was joking. What I want to underline here is that this is not the peculiar ideology of some distant culture. Distant in time it may be, but this is the tradition of gendered speech which we have directly or indirectly inherited. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. Western culture does not owe everything to the Greeks and the Romans, whether it's in speaking or anything else. And I have to say, to be honest, I'm really pleased it doesn't owe everything to the Greeks and Romans. None of us, not even a classicist, would fancy living in a Greco-Roman world. There are all kinds of other different influences on it, and our political system has happily overthrown many of the gendered certainties of the Greeks and the Romans. And yet it remains the fact that our own traditions of debate and public speaking, its conventions and its rules, still lie very much in the shadow of the classical world. Modern techniques, rhetoric and persuasion, which were formulated in the Renaissance, were drawn explicitly from ancient speeches and handouts, and our own terms of rhetorical analysis go back directly to Aristotle and Cicero. In fact, leaving aside President Trump, who I think is slightly different, it used to be very common to point out that Barack Obama or his speechwriters had learnt their best tricks from Cicero himself. Again, we're not simply the victims of our classical inheritance, but classical traditions have provided us with a powerful way of thinking about public speech and for deciding what counts as good oratory or bad, what counts as persuasive oratory, and who has a right to be heard. And gender is a really important part of that mix. It takes only a casual glance at modern Western history to see that many of those classical themes that I've just gone through emerge time and time again. Women who claim a public voice get treated as freaks. Now, the obvious case here is Elizabeth I. I'm sorry, this is about the Spanish Armada. I'm very tactless, but it is her address to her troops in 1588 in the face of the invasion by the Spanish. It is a classic British example. Yes? I know, says Elizabeth, I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. Right? Now, it's not just a speech from the past. It is a slogan that you can still buy, emblazoned on gifts from baby clothes to mugs and skateboards. All right? You'll see some more of these later. If you wonder why we voted for Brexit, this has got something to do with it, I think. Now, the truth is, Elizabeth may never have said anything of the sort. There is no script from Elizabeth. There's no eyewitness account. But for my purpose, the fact that those words might well be fictional make them a better example. Right? If you speak out, you might be a weak and feeble queen, but if you speak, you suddenly become a king, a bloke, a man. Modern traditions of oratory more generally suggest also that that area in which women are allowed to speak, that is, to support women's interests in particular, continues. And some of the most famous speeches there are by women are actually talking about women. This is the case with perhaps the most radical example of female oratory of all from the United States. It is the 1851 speech now entitled "Ain't I a Woman? Am I a Woman?" by a woman with a slave name, Sojourner Truth, who was an ex-slave, an abolitionist, and an American campaigner in the 19th century for women's rights. And she has one very famous speech, "Ain't I a woman? Am I a woman?" And it goes like this, or this is part of it. "I have borne 13 children, and seen 'em most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman?" Now, that is probably only slightly less mythical than Queen Elizabeth's speech. It is always, I haven't been able to read it to you properly, it's always transmitted in the language of the slave South, when in fact Sojourner Truth came from the North and her first language was Dutch. It seems very, very likely that the whole speech was invented as part of the abolition of slavery movement. But it's important nonetheless. Women can speak to say they've had 13 children, they've been sold off into slavery, only Jesus listens, I'm a woman. Right? Now, I'm not, of course, saying that women's voices raised in support of women's causes aren't important. You know, you might well say someone has got to speak up for women, and when women do that, that's a good thing. But it remains the case that women's public speech for centuries has been focused on that particular area. To put it simply, there have been in the Western world far more female ministers of health in parliaments, health being a woman's area, than there have been ministers of finance, finance being a male area. So my question is, what happens when women try to speak up more widely? Now, I have some experience of that on the internet, especially on Twitter, and I've got some experience of getting abused. Now, I want to say again, the kind of abuse that I and others have received is not only directed against women or against people who take a public platform. There is some horrible abuse that targets grieving parents of dead teenagers who have no public profile whatsoever. But the truth is that abuse online does target women hugely more than men. One academic study put the ratio at something like 30 to 1, 30 female to 1 male target. And it particularly targets women who decide to speak out in the public sphere. And from what I have received and read, it targets women's right to speak. And I think very interestingly, the advice you're given on how to deal with this when it happens actually reasserts the idea that you should be silent. If you get internet abuse, what you are told is pay no attention to them, do not reply, and just block them. That always makes me think, okay, so we're in this very odd position that someone has threatened me on the internet, they abuse me, they misreport what I said, and the right thing for me to do is just say nothing, right? Isn't that actually simply reinforcing what the silence of women was always about in the first place? In my experience, whatever you decide to say as a woman, if you venture into traditional male territory, the abuse comes anyway. It's not what you say that prompts the abuse, it's simply the fact that you're saying it. And that matches the nature of the abuse itself. I don't know how many people there are here tonight who have been through this kind of thing on the internet. But what you get when you get abuse like this, you get a predictable menu of threats of rape, bombing, murder, and so forth. And I sound relaxed about it now. When it comes to you, you don't feel relaxed. Significantly, though, there's a significant subsection of this abuse that specifically focuses on silencing you as a woman. A very common refrain is, "Shut up, you bitch." Right? Or it threatens to remove your capacity to speak. I got a tweet once which said, "I'm going to cut off your head and rape it." Right? I mean, mad, but it's removing your ability to say anything. And one tweet I saw being sent to a British journalist said, "You should have your tongue ripped out." Now, in its crude, aggressive way, and it is horrible, what this language is about shutting women out of man's talk. It's not really about what that woman's saying. It's telling her she's not allowed to speak. And in some ways, the 140 characters of a tweet act as a rather good magnifying glass on the sort of attitudes we find elsewhere. Because it's not hard for me to see some connection between those crude tweets and what happens in the British House of Commons when MPs just shout women down if they don't want to listen to them. And I'm told that in the Afghan parliament, where they're up to exactly the same tricks, the men simply disconnect the microphones of the women they don't want to listen to. There is, in fact, still a very strong strand of Western argument that claims that the very nature of public debate is polluted by women's engagement with it. Henry James, one of my favourite American novelists of the 19th century, is actually one of the worst culprits in this. He said, he was talking about women's speech in America. Under American women's influence, he insisted, language risks becoming a generalized mumble or jumble, a tongueless slobber or snarl or whine. It will sound, if you let women get at the American language, it will sound, guess what, like the moo of the cow, the bray of the ass, and the bark of the dog. Surprise, surprise. Right. Okay. Now, another example came only a few months ago when United States Senator Elizabeth Warren was prevented from reading out a letter by Coretta Scott King in the Senate and was effectively thrown out of the American Senate. That was given a lot of publicity. What was extraordinary about this occasion, and what didn't get so much publicity, was that it was not only that she was told to stop reading the letter and then thrown out of the Senate, but over the next couple of days, several men did read the letter out, and they were neither excluded or told to stop. Now, actually, they were trying to support Warren, but it's clear that the rules of speech that apply to Elizabeth Warren did not apply to Bernie Sanders or the others who did the same. But that raises the big question of what women do to claim power, and the many ways in which they're excluded from it or attacked if they reach those crucial nexuses of power at the highest level. There are relatively few countries in the world where women's representation in Parliament exceeds 30%. Spain does a lot better than the United Kingdom in this respect, though both of us beat the United States by a considerable margin. And in some of those countries where there is a large female representation in Parliament, one strongly suspects that that is because power does not really lie in Parliament. The country in the world, I bet you can't guess the answer to this, the country in the world with the highest proportion of women in Parliament is Rwanda, with over 60%. And while there are reasons to cheer, I very much doubt that it is a model for us, and I very much doubt that it correlates with female authority in Rwanda. Now, we all know, and this relates closely to their voice, I think, we all know some of the strategies that modern female politicians adopt to make themselves and their voice have greater impact in this male territory. Obviously, they have voice coaching to make their voices deeper so that they sound more like men. It's what Margaret Thatcher famously did. She famously lowered her voice so that she did not appear to whine or scream. They also often dress like men. And I think that we recognise the androgynous clothing that many women adopt to turn themselves into almost male politicians. Angela Merkel and Hillary Clinton are both good examples of that. And one problem here is not just, I think, the voice, but the problem is that in our collective unconscious, there's no image of what a woman in power looks like. If you shut your eyes and think of a man in power, you have plenty of images in front of you. If you shut your eyes and think of a woman in power, you have a woman dressed like a man. That's what you have. Even so, even though I think that this is much wider about image making than just voice, I think it's clear that even with these high-level female politicians, the abuse still attacks their speaking parts, that is to say, their heads. And this is where we're going to go back, and you'll see the relevance in a minute, to one of the most famous myths of all in the classical world, the myth of the Gorgon, Medusa, the monstrous female hybrid with snakes instead of hair, whose very look, it was said, could turn a man to stone. There are many ancient versions of Medusa's story. One famous version has her originally as a beautiful woman raped by the god Poseidon in a temple of the goddess Athena, who promptly transformed her as a punishment for this sacrifice. And notice the woman gets punished for her own rape, right? Transformed her into this monstrous creature that we now know. It later became the task of the hero Perseus to kill this woman, and he cut off her head, but cleverly using a shiny shield as a mirror, so he wouldn't have directly to look at her, because if he'd looked at her, she would have turned him to stone. At first, he used the head as a weapon, since even in death, it retained its capacity to turn people to stone. But he then, as you can see on the left here, presented it to the goddess Athena, who went on to display it on her own armour. Yeah. Oh, there's an arrow. I put an arrow in, that's right. Yeah, that was clever. One message here is take care that you don't look too closely at Athena, it will turn you to stone. Now, the clash between Perseus and Medusa the Gorgon has been a consistent and repeated theme in art since the Renaissance. Here is Benvenuto Cellini's famous statue of Perseus, this is in Florence, holding up the decapitated head of the Gorgon while he treads on her, awful statue, while he treads on her dismembered body underneath. And then you have that extremely disturbing picture by Caravaggio of the bleeding head of Medusa. Now, there have been many notable occasions in modern feminism when women theorists have tried to reclaim Medusa as a feminist icon. Unsuccessfully, I have to say. It is the male beheading and silencing of Medusa that has, beyond everything else, entered modern culture and has remained a symbol of vicious opposition to women's power whenever they claim it, and in a sense, because it's the head, vicious opposition to women's speech. Angela Merkel's features have again and again been superimposed onto Caravaggio's image. Even our own rather frosty Prime Minister in Britain has been called the Medusa of Maidenhead, Maidenhead being the place that Theresa May represents in Parliament, and has a reputation for being extremely proper and bourgeois, which is part of the joke, Medusa of Maidenhead. One newspaper noticed the nickname Medusa of Maidenhead and said rather, well, faux naively, I suppose, the Medusa comparison might be a bit strong, it said. We all know that Mrs. May has beautiful hair, right? But Mrs. May got off lightly compared with Dilma Rousseff, who was from Brazil, who had to open this is really bad luck. She had to open a major Caravaggio show in Sao Paulo, and the Medusa was in it, and every journalist and every photographer got her standing in front of the Medusa picture. But it is with Hillary Clinton that we see the Medusa theme at its starkest, and I think becoming to be slightly nastiest. Predictably, Donald Trump's supporters in the last election campaign produced a great number of images showing her with snaky locks. That was, I think, sort of fair game. But there was one horribly memorable version which adapted Cellini's Bronze and turned Trump into Perseus, right? So Hillary Clinton's head is Medusa and Trump is Perseus. In the interest of taste, they didn't include the mangled body, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that scene, just like the Elizabeth I speech in England, became part of the absolutely domestic souvenir wear of the American election campaign. You could buy it on T-shirts, on tank tops, on coffee mugs, on laptop sleeves, and on tote bags. Now, I think you look at this and it is silly. You know, there is something slightly ridiculous, slightly funny about it. I think if you reflect for another couple of seconds, you see that there's something very unpleasant here. There is a kind of normalization of gendered violence as part of an election campaign. If you were ever doubtful, I think, about the extent to which the exclusion of women from power and from the power to be heard is culturally embedded, and if you were unsure about the continued resonance of the classical forms for displaying that and, in a sense, justifying it, I think all you need to see is Trump and Clinton as Perseus and Medusa. It is true that if you search around the darker recesses of the web, you can find some very nasty images of President Obama too. But they are in the darker recesses of the web. It is also true that there was a controversial image later circulated of the bleeding, severed head of President Trump. But in that case, the satirist concerned, who was female, lost her job. In the Clinton case, it was just a souvenir. So, oops, sorry, wrong way. To go back to Miss Triggs, the question is, what can we do for Miss Triggs, or for other women, and I mean us, who deserve to be heard or to be recognised as authoritative? Now, I'm sure I don't need to underline that this is an important goal. It is not simply unfair on Miss Triggs to deprive her of her voice. It is unfair on all of us not to take advantage directly of what Miss Triggs has to say. Without hearing these voices of women, we all lose out. But the question is, how do we get to hear them? How do we learn to hear them? And what's the remedy? Well, first, I suppose, we have to remember that there are things to celebrate and things to take credit for. There is now no country in the world, apart from the Vatican City. I'm not quite sure how many women there are in the Vatican City, but I expect there are some, who do not have the vote in some form. My own mother was born in the United Kingdom before women had the vote, and much as she hated Mrs. Thatcher with every bone in her body, she was very pleased to have lived to see a woman Prime Minister. In a sense, after thousands of years of Western culture, which asserted that women have no voice or power, we have, especially in the last 15 years, done better. But it remains the case that we're a long way from equality, and so far, with one or two strange exceptions, we really haven't learnt to see how women and power might go together. Just think, for example, and I hope this works in Spanish as well as it does in English, if you think of the adjective ambitious. In the English language, if you say that of a man, that is a mark of approval. He's an ambitious man, he's going places, he's on his way to the top. If you say it of a woman, it is a criticism. Right? It's a mark of, it's an implied criticism that she's untrustworthy, she's out for herself, and so on. And I often think that I shall know that some of the job has been done when you can talk about an ambitious woman without it being a criticism. So how do we change it, is the question. Well, put like that, I just wish I knew the answer. If I knew the answer, I would share it with you. I don't think there can be a group of female friends or colleagues anywhere in Europe and possibly anywhere in the world who haven't regularly discussed the day-to-day aspects of what I'm calling the Miss Triggs question, whether it's in the office, the factory, the committee room, the council chamber, the seminar, or Parliament. I've spent hours of my life discussing with my female friends how I got my point heard, how do I get noticed, how do I feel that I belong in the male discussion. Now, I know it's something that some men feel too. I'm here to talk about women this evening, but don't want to suggest that I don't think that I think that women are the only people without a voice on the planet. All the same, I think if there's one thing that we know bonds women of all backgrounds, political and skin colours, businesses, professions, it's the classic experience of the failed intervention in a man's discussion. I'm going to tell you how it feels to me, and I hope some of you will recognise it. You're at a meeting, you make a point, then there's silence. Nobody says anything. It's all a bit awkward for a couple of seconds, and then some man picks up from where he was before and says, well, what I was saying was, and it's as if the point you were making had just not existed. It feels like you might as well never have opened your mouth, and I think you end up blaming both yourself for being so hopeless and the men whose exclusive club the discussion appears to be. Now, however long we discuss this, in my experience, none of the answers that women come up with are very satisfactory. Mostly they come down to tricks or to aping some aspect of male rhetoric, in particular lowering the voice on the Margaret Thatcher model, and so on and so on. And in some ways that's fine. If it works, maybe we should say it's fine. But it risks reinforcing the same old stereotypes. You know, if you have to lower your voice in order to be heard as a woman, that is reinforcing the idea that it is only the male voice which seems to have authority. I guess I'm going to finish with what I think might be called two ways forward, but I don't think they're solutions. First, I think it does help to think together, and more fundamentally, about the rules of how our rhetoric and our discussion operate. Now, I don't mean by that the old standby, which you often hear, that, oh, well, men and women talk different languages, don't they? If men and women do talk different languages, the only reason is because they've been taught to talk different languages. And I don't really mean the kind of pop psychology of men are from Mars and women are from Venus or whatever. My hunch is that if we're going to make real progress with the Maestricht's question, we need to go back to some of the first principles about the nature of the authority of the voice, about what constitutes an authoritative voice, and how we have learnt to hear authority where we do. And rather than push women into voice training classes, which now is what happens, we should perhaps be thinking more about the fault lines and the fractures that underlie dominant male discourse. We need to bring to the surface, not just talk together, about all those questions that we tend to shelve, about how we speak in public, why we do, and whose voice fits. What I suppose I'm recommending is some old-fashioned consciousness raising about what we mean by a voice of authority and how we've come to construct it. And here, as just very occasionally, the Greco-Roman world can sometimes help us, because even the Romans just occasionally saw the problems of gendered discourse. When the wife of Mark Antony went into the Roman Forum, took out her hairpins, so it was said, and with her hairpins pierced the tongue of the severed head of the orator Cicero, who had been her husband's great enemy, pinned up in the Forum in the Roman way for all to see. That was one way, albeit a very nasty, bloody way, in which the Romans were pointing to the idea of male voice, female voice, the idea of the woman using the adornments of her hair to pierce the tongue of the male orator. I'll just put you a rather elaborate version from the 19th century there, where the wife appears to have brought the severed head home in order to pierce it in the privacy of her bedroom. In the main story, she did it in the Forum. So I think we might just have to listen to some of them, work out if there are things that we're simply not seeing which points to some of these problems, and share them, not just in women's groups. But I think my main point would be, and this is rather more radical, is I think that we have to think about power differently. Everything I've discussed so far has treated power, whether of the voice or parliamentary power, in an extremely elite sense of the word, coupled to public prestige, to charisma, to leadership, and perhaps also to a degree of celebrity. It's also, I think, treating power very narrowly as a noun, as a thing that only a few people can possess and wield. If I have it, you can't. Right? And within the cultural imagination, it is, as we've seen it, a possession. Power is a possession of men. That's exactly what's summed up by the image of Perseus or Trump brandishing the power of his sword. On those terms, women as a gender, not as some individuals, but women as a gender are, in my view, by definition, excluded from it. You can't easily fit women into a structure of power that is already defined as male. You have to change the structure. And that means thinking about power differently. And I think for a start, it means decoupling, disassociating power from public prestige. It means trying to think about power collaboratively, about the power of the followers, not just of the leaders. And it means, I think, above all, about thinking about power as an attribute you might have, not as a possession that you own, or even as a verb, to power, right? Not, absolutely not, as something you possess. What I'm talking about here is power as the ability to be effective, the ability to make a difference in the world, and the right to be taken seriously. That's what, for me, that's what power is. Right to be taken seriously, together as much as individually. And it's power in that sense that many women feel they don't have. They're not taken seriously, and that's what they want. And I think there are possible, I'm not over-optimistic, but there are possible signs of a change in these assumptions about what power is, what it can do, and women's engagement. I'm struck, for example, that one of the most influential and occasionally controversial political movements of the last few years, at least in the United States, has been Black Lives Matter. It's made a huge impact. Where does the movement Black Lives Matter come from, and how was it started? The answer is it was founded by 3 women. And most of us, let alone in Europe, most of us, even in America, would not know or recognize the names of those women, but together, without the celebrity, they did have the power to get things done in a different way, and they did it. And I think possibly that is what we might see more of. At least I hope we're going to see more of, because I put Miss Triggs back on the screen to say Miss Triggs deserves to be heard. Thank you.
Great. Brilliant as ever. Muchísimas gracias, Mary.
Thank you very much, Mary. Of course, well, the chat has been absolutely fascinating, and I guess that there must be some questions. People are really interested. So anybody who wants to pose a question, any suggestion, please feel free. Any expansion of what we've heard, please don't be shy. Thank you. May I say it in English? Well, you can pose a question either in English or Spanish, as you want.
So, first, I want to say that the talk was amazing, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to listen to you. And now, my question is, it's according to the Amazons. The Amazons, as we all know, were a tribe, well, we can be considered a tribe of women that were warriors during the time of the Greeks and Romans, probably. And there were a lot of stories about the Amazons. And obviously, the Greek and the Roman people had knowledge of these women. They were warriors. They fought just like men did at that time. So my question is, if Greek and Roman women knew about these Amazons, why did they not do something just like they did?
I'm afraid we're going to disagree on the facts here. It is true that there have been some feminist scholars who have claimed that if you go to Scythia, you can find traces of what they have argued look like real-life female warriors. I've looked at this evidence a bit, and I do not believe a word of it. The fact that you have women buried with some military equipment does not mean that they're women warriors. So what I would say, in answer to your question, though there will be other people sitting up here who, I would agree with you. So what you said is not stupid, it's just I disagree. In my own view, what is the role of the Amazons in, let's say, classical Athenian culture? It's not to be powerful women, it's to be defeated. The Amazons' job is to be killed. And that's how we see them on the Parthenon, on Greek pottery. Occasionally, we get a sense that there's an erotic danger in the Amazons, as in the story that at the very moment that the hero Achilles kills the Amazon queen, Penthesilea, they look at each other and they fall in love. But it's too late, because she's dead. Right? But my standard reading of the Amazons would be that they are the absolute classic counterexample whose defeat by civilization is constantly paraded before your eyes. But your point raises another question, which I will just preempt before somebody asks it. But I think goes with, I show very briefly the goddess Athena. And I remember going to Athens with my mother, the first time she'd been. And she asked the kind of question that one's mother always asks, which is apparently naive, but actually quite clever. Said, I don't understand, if this is such a terribly oppressive culture against women, why is the main temple dedicated to a female goddess? Certainly when I was 21, I could not answer that question. Now I can answer it, which is to say, look, actually, there's lots of these female characters floating around Greek mythology, and none of them are really women. And if you look at Athena, she looks as kind of slightly odd as any Athenian god or goddess looks to us. But to the Athenian population, their patron deity was as strange and freakish a hybrid as any androgyne you could ever hope for. Athena was not a woman. She wasn't even born from a woman. She was born from the head of her father. She was this wonderful fantasy of Greek misogyny that you could actually have childbirth without women. You could actually cut babies out of God's heads, right? And she's a warrior. And everything we know, and this is why the Amazons are so weird, to go back to them, everything we know about the kind of binary coding of Greek society is that women do not fight. To look at Athena has something of the oddity for us, I think, that if we can try and project back what the oddity was, of seeing, now a child soldier with a large Kalashnikov. Children and guns do not go together. Women and armor do not go together. Athena has no babies, is a virgin, therefore not a woman, and is not even born from a woman. She's wonderful.
I see. Thanks a lot.
Somebody there.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. When you speak about power, you seem to link it to the public sphere all the time. And I'm curious to know why you do not deal with power in the private sphere.
There's two reasons for that. I mean, one answer to that is you're right. And in a sense, my problem is slightly different from yours, that if you go to most of the data that you can get about women's engagement, it's very elite level engagement. It's easy to find out the number of women in Parliament. It's not easy to find out the number of women who are chairing trade union committees. So you get pushed up, and I think that's a difficulty. I mean, just in doing any of this stuff, getting the data below that level is hard. I think that there's two things I'd say, though, in response. One is, I think I've been through the idea that it's fine that women are fine, they're powerful in the home. Well, I'm being bought off with that. I don't want to be powerful in the home. I want to get out there like Penelope and say something. And telling me that I was really powerful when no one can see me, with 2 children under 10 to whom I'm all powerful, that doesn't work with me. And that's not saying that motherhood and the domestic sphere is not important, but the disequilibrium between saying, oh, it's all right, the men can go out, they can go out into the city, they can go out and run the world, and we'll run the household, and so it doesn't convince. Where I think, though, that I would meet you, I suspect, is in a sense what I was trying to say at the end, though rather too briefly, was that if we can actually see a way of changing what we think power is, then we're going to have a much better way of changing women's, and in a sense recognizing women's engagement with it. Now, I think that that's very rarely done. And I think that this may be different in this country, but in the United Kingdom, you find that every area. I've gone off. No, I haven't. Every area of employment that used to be female employment that has been has welcomed men recently, what you find is that the men get to the top, the men get to be the spokespersons and to earn the most money. Primary school teaching, nursing. Now, what I think we've got to do, that's why I think the Black Lives Matter thing is very interesting, partly because that was a big political campaign, but the women didn't become celebrities. They didn't become Mark Zuckerberg or whoever. Nobody knows who they were, and it was showing, it seems to me, a model of power, whether that is in a university, or in a factory, in the shop, in the workplace, in Parliament, in local government, that is actually quite at variance with the way the power of celebrity, or the celebrity of power, is now conceived. I think of it very much in the kind of courses that are put on in my university for people in my position, which is come and learn how to be a better leader, you know, and as if somehow leadership was something that you could, you know, get an A grade in. But also, I always write back, and they get so fed up with me, saying, when are you going to have your course to how to be a better follower? You know, if you've got leadership, you know, leadership is a model of how something is run, how the world is run, which is absolutely conventional power talk. And so I'm with you, except I don't want it to be in the home. You know, I'm fed up with the home. It's like being told, actually, this is a really anti-feminist thing I'm going to say, but I will say it. It's like being told that making a patchwork quilt is as good as Velázquez, and it's just that you know, somehow male culture has told us that oil painting's better than quilting. I'm afraid I think oil painting is better than quilting, and I don't want to be left doing the quilting. And that's a bit what I think my answer to that. No, you're very polite. Mostly, if I'd said that, I would have got pelted. No?
I was just wondering if you think it's at all ironic that up until now only men have dared to raise their voices to ask you questions. And I
haven't got my glasses on, and I was waiting to see what you were. I can't hear what you were.
I'm a woman, or am I? Because I'm speaking now, so I'm not sure. And it's quite strange because I feel quite nervous doing this. And I wonder if any of the other women in the room feel nervous about sticking their hands up and asking a question.
Yeah. Yes. Why do you
okay,
think
some of them. It's not really a question, it was more of an observation.
Can I ask you, can I ask back to you, though? Why do you think that is?
Maybe because I haven't had much practice at it, and then if that's cultural, I couldn't say 100%, but possibly.
See, I don't think men have got... in any individual case, that might be true. But it never seems to shut men up. Oh, sorry, this is not a criticism of those men that have already spoken. You notice it when teaching, very clearly. You'll have a small group of women and men. And the fact that the men don't know the answer does not prevent them answering the question. And I feel very conflicted by that, because I both think the women are sensible to shut up. You know, why just open your mouth when you're going to speak rubbish? On the other hand, I see it works. And I see they get the floor, they get noticed, and so on. I think it's really very hard. And you will not believe this, because I expect you think that I now seem terribly at ease with talking in public, and in some ways I am, I think. When I was a graduate student, a PhD student, and a young lecturer, probably until I was at least 30 plus, I used to go to seminars and I never dared open my mouth. And I was one of those people who went to the pub afterwards and got in a huddle with my friends. You know, we used to complain that we couldn't get why couldn't we get our points across? Why did it seem to be, just a conversation between men? Why did it? And we used to have, as I just indicated, we had all kinds of little tricks we were going to try. We would say things like, if you ask a question, I'll make sure there's no silence after your question. And it never worked. It really, really never worked. And people now often say, so what did make a difference for you? And as in all these things, one's very bad at analysing one's own autobiographical experience. But I know when I recognised that it felt different. And that was when I said something in public and I heard it in my own ears, it sounded like me. Always before, when I'd opened my mouth, it sounded as if I was an actor, as if I was somebody saying something that didn't belong to me. And the noticeable difference, and what has gone on forever after, is that sometimes I say things that are really stupid, sometimes I don't answer the question properly. I always hear it in my head as me speaking. And that is something which has given me the confidence to speak. Because before, I thought I was pretending to be an academic. I was pretending to be a participant. I was somehow speaking somebody else's words. And now I feel I'm speaking my own. Sometimes, perhaps it might have been better not to, but then I know that I own my words. And that, I think, is a really big thing to hang on to.
Sí, yo quisiera preguntarle.
I would like to ask you, taking some perspective towards the ancient world, and consistently to the proposal that you've done here tonight, I would like to speak about two myths, like Cleopatra and Dido. I think that they are two very relevant figures that are studied not only from our current perspective, but we're looking for you. I was at your back. When I think about how all stories about Cleopatra or Dido have reached us, I see that they have come to our days as two women, not because of the task that they did at their kingdoms or areas, but as two women, the projection of which was to be subdued to love to a man. The story is very elusive, very schematic, because we really don't know anything about them. We don't know anything about their triumphs, about their accomplishments. What do we know? We know that their fame was accomplished by men because they were subdued by love to men.
I think Dido in particular fits also very nicely into my category of women who speak before they die. Because, okay, she does speak, in the Aeneid she speaks a bit in the run-up to the suicide, but her great moment to speak is before her death on the pyre. But I also agree that there's something both, I think, slightly touching, but also deeply dispiriting about what modern 20th century culture has done with them. Because instead of seeing Cleopatra in particular as a woman who, within the Greco-Roman tradition, is invented simply to be subdued, for much of the 20th century, she was somehow reanimated as in a sense, the power in the relationship with Mark Antony. Mark Antony is the guy who, is hopeless. 20th century fiction, Mark Antony's just, a rather weak drunkard, and Cleopatra has it. Now, actually, that is not how it was in the ancient world. I feel like even more strongly with plays by Aristophanes. I mean, I didn't actually talk really much about, or at all about Aristophanes' play Lysistrata, but that always now is played as a feminist play, when in the Aristophanic original, it is an entirely, it in a sense entirely undermines women's power. It ends with, in a sense, a woman being divided up in an erotic scene of division. So when I was talking to some undergraduates recently about this, and we talked about Cleopatra and Aristophanes, and I was saying to them, look, it's odd, because what we've done is we've entirely overturned the ancient version of these stories. They were very keen that they thought that was a good idea, that myths were for subverting, and it was great. If Cleopatra, sure, in ancient mythology, because basically she's a myth, she was there to be subdued, then we are fighting back in making a powerful Cleopatra. I don't know, I'm with you, I think. And it fits exactly. The women who speak are there to be undone.
The truth is that that sublimation, that reaches a climax, from my point of view, in the Frankfurt School, when they study the myth of Odysseus. They reach the conclusion that that myth falls in the Enlightenment, and that Enlightenment that wanted us to take away from myths falls back again into the myth. Because we don't rescue any women's voice among this array of philosophers, like are to extent messianic in some way, but very classicist, and also they put women in a second level, in a second class, so to speak.
I think that's an absolutely legitimate way of seeing it. Yeah. It intersects. That's not what I'm arguing, but it intersects and matches what I'm arguing, I think. Run this way now.
Gracias. Thank you. Thanks very much for the talk. I am a journalist. As you know, I had the opportunity to interview you before, so I make my living with words and mostly with speaking in public, since I also work in the radio. And that's why I'm wondering, how do you explain, I don't fully understand how can not be power about possession, about having it, since in the public sphere there is a limited amount of minutes on air, there is a limited amount of seats on big companies' board. If we don't own those minutes, if we don't own that space, how can we be in the public sphere as women talking? Because since, as far as I can remember, I've always been a minority in a radio studio when speaking about economy or politics, and not only about being a female, also about being under 40. There are not many examples like that, and I think
not many over 60 either.
Well, you're totally right, but more than under. Like, there is a second discrimination there on age, I think. And I think there is also about owning that space.
I think I find that quite difficult. I think I'd say two things. One is, I think there will be an interesting discussion here about how that was differently configured on television and on radio. Certainly in Britain, radio is a much more is a medium that has been much more sensitive to women's voices than television. I don't know about this ownership of time. I mean, in some ways you have to be right. You know, you can measure minutes. Minutes are measurable, and that you can have your space. I think that in a way I'm struggling a bit about this, but I think that it is there is a kind of what I would call in English a zero-sum game here about power. You know, if I have it, you don't. It seems to me that we have to re-examine that kind of sense of if I've got it, you can't have it. Power is essentially held by is a singleton. I mean, singletons might join up with each other, but it's very egomaniac. It seems to me that we just ought to try to push out the boundaries of what power might consist in, and whether we do think that it's how we could configure what I think is the most important thing, which is being effective and being taken seriously. How we can configure that without what is in Britain certainly the public celebrity aspects of power. You see, I think that's where radio and television is interesting, because before I did television, I used to do quite a lot of radio. And one of the things that's wonderful about radio is that nobody recognizes you. And it changes the nature of the power relations in the medium, I think. That you can read the news on the radio. It can be the most famous name in Britain and be absolutely unrecognizable. Now, in some ways, I rather like that definition of power. I like that kind of sense that it is not correlating with ownership of it and the celebrity nature of it. But you know, if I was on the radio for my job, I would want to own my minutes.
Thanks very much. It's just that Trump owns it and Hillary doesn't, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Trump and Twitter he is making an attempt to own Twitter, I think. Quite interesting. I mean, it's horrible, but it's very interesting.
La última pregunta, por favor.
The last question, please.
Tonight about how women have been taken away from the public speaking and how this happened in the past, but yet here we are, where I'm asking you a question, right, in this place. So how you say we've got to this point? Have there been tipping points or places in history where things have changed? What is just your perspective on this, and can we learn from those to keep going in the direction, or are we going to change direction? What is your perspective
I think that's very hard, and as I said just now, one's very bad at analysing one's own autobiography, and one's not all that good at analysing the experiences through which one has lived. What is absolutely clear to me is that despite the fact that overall, I think we've not done anything like enough to hear women speak. I mean, I think it's quite extraordinary that the voice of authority is still male. However, I can track the way that has changed in my lifetime a little, largely by strangely unthought out anecdotal examples, which normally reflect two ways. I remember the first time, I was on an aeroplane, and it was the moment when the captain says, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," and it was a woman. And I remember that my first thought was, why is the chief steward, why are the cabin crew speaking for the captain? And then, that went through my head for about 3 seconds. And then I thought, oh God, this is a woman pilot. Now, the trouble about that story is that it both says, look, here is the woman flying the plane speaking to you in a way that 50 years ago would have been impossible. What I find, for me, the unnerving thing is that even I thought there was a mistake. And I suppose the optimistic view, and I'm not sure I share this optimistic view, but the optimistic view is one of gradualism. And that now I quite often hear a woman pilot, and sort of my view about who flies a plane has changed. Though I did recently do some kind of quick tests on, Google is always a good way of getting your eye into the popular culture. I put into Google Images in the UK, professor. And I think that out of the first 100 images in Google Images, 97 were male. Now, what I thought was, look, actually, even I don't, if I close my eyes and I think professor, I think I see a man. I'm a bloody female professor. And I close my eyes and I see Jaime. Now, that might be because I'm just old and hopeless. It might be because things gradually will change. Or it might be that there's bigger work to be done. And I have to say, I know it's different from the 1960s. I remember what it was like in the 1960s. But I can't give you a prognosis. And I'm not entirely certain how different it is. That's feeble, but true.
Muy bien, pues.
Okay, so we've reached the limit of the time that we have allocated to us. If I am allowed to speak on behalf of the Universidad Carlos III from Madrid, I would like to thank all those present here for having shown interest on this initiative, and I would also like to thank the Fundación Telefónica that has lent us their infrastructure to be able to listen to Mary Bird's voice and to have this encounter that you see on the screen. Thank you very much, Mary, for devoting part of your time to us, for having made us stop along the way during very intense days here among us in Madrid. Congratulations on your conference, and thank you very much to all the attendees. Thank you.